You are lying awake at 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, replaying a moment that refuses to leave you alone. Maybe it was the funeral of someone who never deserved to suffer. Maybe it was the phone call that changed your life in 30 seconds. Maybe it was watching someone beg for help and receive silence, not a dramatic silence, not a cinematic silence, just the ordinary silence that arrives when life refuses to explain itself. And in that moment, whether you consider yourself religious, skeptical, spiritual, uncertain, or somewhere in between, a question slips into your mind that feels dangerous even to think. Not because it is forbidden, not because someone told you not to ask it, because once it appears, it becomes difficult to make it disappear. The question is not whether God exists. Surprisingly, that is not the question that haunts most people when they are alone. The question is something far more unsettling. If there is a God, why does reality feel so indifferent to the things that matter most to us? Most people spend years arguing about existence while quietly avoiding that deeper discomfort. They debate evidence, philosophy, history, science, tradition, and belief, but beneath all of it sits a feeling that rarely receives honest attention. It is the feeling that the world does not behave the way we think a meaningful universe should behave. You can be kind and still lose everything. You can be cruel and still succeed. You can spend years doing what you believe is right and watch someone else achieve more through manipulation, luck, or timing. You can pray, doubt, hope, despair, trust, rebel, surrender, and the universe often appears completely unmoved by your emotional state. That observation creates a psychological tension many people spend their entire lives trying to escape. Because deep down, most of us carry an assumption we rarely examine. We assume that meaning should be visible. We assume that justice should be understandable. We assume that purpose should reveal itself. We assume that if there is something greater behind existence, we should be able to recognize its fingerprints. Yet experience repeatedly confronts us with situations where those fingerprints seem impossible to find. Think about the moments that changed you the most, not the victories, the losses, the betrayals, the disappointments, the seasons when nothing made sense, the periods when you felt abandoned by life itself. What made those experiences so painful was not only the suffering. It was the absence of explanation. Human beings can endure extraordinary pain when they believe it serves a purpose. History is filled with examples of people surviving unimaginable circumstances because they attached meaning to their struggle. But uncertainty creates a different kind of wound. It creates a wound that attacks the mind itself. The mind wants answers. The mind wants patterns. The mind wants causes and effects. The mind wants to believe that suffering can be translated into understanding. Yet many experiences refuse to cooperate. They remain unresolved, unfinished, unexplained. And that is where the real problem begins, not necessarily a problem with God, a problem with the relationship between human expectations and reality. If this question has ever crossed your mind, even briefly, leave your perspective below. Not because there is one correct answer, but because almost everyone wrestles with this in private, while pretending they do not. The strange thing is that the older people become, the less interested they often are in certainty, and the more interested they become in honesty. Children usually ask simple questions. Adults discover that the questions become more complicated. A child asks why something happened. An adult eventually realizes that sometimes nobody knows. A child expects a clear answer. An adult learns that reality often provides only fragments, and somewhere along that journey, many people encounter a realization that changes everything. The greatest challenge is not always suffering itself. The greatest challenge is meaninglessness, or perhaps the fear of meaninglessness, because those are not the same thing. The fear of meaninglessness can be even more powerful than meaninglessness itself. Consider how often people create explanations simply because uncertainty feels unbearable. We build stories, we create narratives, we search for signs, we interpret coincidences, we look backward and connect events into patterns. Sometimes those patterns are profound, sometimes they are comforting, sometimes they are accurate, sometimes they are illusions. The uncomfortable truth is that human beings are meaning-making creatures. We are constantly transforming chaos into narrative because narrative makes existence psychologically manageable. Imagine two people experiencing the exact same tragedy. One believes the experience has purpose. The other believes it is random. The emotional outcome may be dramatically different, even though the event itself is identical. That observation reveals something important about the human condition. We do not merely experience reality. We experience our interpretation of reality. And this is where a deeper tension begins to emerge. Many discussions about God focus on what people believe. Far fewer discussions focus on why people need certain beliefs. Need is an uncomfortable word because it suggests vulnerability. It suggests dependency. It suggests that belief is not only about truth, but also about survival. Most people do not want to admit how much of their emotional stability depends on assumptions they rarely examine. We tell ourselves we are rational. We tell ourselves we are objective. Yet, when life becomes painful enough, almost everyone reaches for some form of meaning. Some reach through religion, some through philosophy, some through relationships, some through achievement, some through service, some through art, some through identity. The object changes. The psychological need remains. We want our suffering to matter. We want our existence to matter. We want our story to matter. And perhaps that desire itself reveals something fascinating. Maybe the biggest problem nobody talks about is not that God remains mysterious. Maybe it is that human beings struggle to accept mystery at all. We crave certainty, with an intensity that often exceeds our willingness to confront reality honestly. We want final answers to questions that may not have final answers available to us. We want clarity where ambiguity exists. We want closure where existence offers none. Think about how uncomfortable silence feels during a difficult conversation. Think about how quickly people rush to fill it. Now imagine that silence stretched across years. Imagine carrying questions that never receive complete answers. Imagine wanting certainty about the most important aspects of existence and receiving only partial glimpses. That is where many people secretly live. They continue functioning, they continue working, they continue laughing, they continue posting photographs and making plans and paying bills and pursuing goals. But beneath the surface sits a tension they rarely discuss. They are not struggling with evidence, they are struggling with uncertainty. And uncertainty has a way of exposing things we would rather not see. It exposes our need for control. It exposes our fear of randomness. It exposes our vulnerability. It exposes how fragile many of our assumptions really are. There is a moment many people experience at least once in life. A moment when something they believed would never happen suddenly happens. A relationship ends. A dream collapses. A loved one dies. A diagnosis arrives. A betrayal appears. A future disappears. And suddenly, the mental framework that once organized reality no longer functions. The person is forced into a confrontation with questions they successfully avoided for years. Why do terrible things happen? Why do good intentions fail? Why does life seem unfair? Why does suffering appear so unevenly distributed? Those questions are ancient because they are human, and they persist because every generation discovers them again through personal experience. What makes them powerful is that they are not merely intellectual, they are emotional. They emerge from grief, confusion, disappointment, and longing. They emerge from the collision between expectation and reality. Yet something even more unsettling waits beneath those questions, and it is this realization that makes many people uncomfortable. Sometimes what we call a problem with God may actually be a problem with the stories we expect reality to follow. And if that possibility is true, then the conversation becomes far more complicated than most people realize. Because it forces us to examine not only what we believe about existence, but what existence owes us in the first place. And that is where the deeper conflict begins. Think back to a moment when life gave you exactly what you wanted, not what you settled for, not what you convinced yourself was enough, what you genuinely wanted. Maybe it was a relationship, a career opportunity, a financial breakthrough, acceptance from someone whose approval mattered to you, or simply a season when everything finally seemed to work. Now ask yourself a difficult question. How long did the satisfaction last before your mind moved the finish line again? A week? A month? A year? Most people discover something strange when they examine their lives honestly. The things they believed would permanently satisfy them rarely do. The achievement arrives, the excitement peaks, and then something unexpected happens. Normality returns. The human mind adapts. The extraordinary becomes ordinary. The miracle becomes routine. The dream becomes reality, and reality becomes familiar. Then a new desire appears, a new goal, a new source of dissatisfaction. This pattern is so common that many people never notice how much of their emotional life is organized around chasing future meaning rather than experiencing present meaning. Why does this matter? Because when people discuss God, purpose, or existence, they often assume the central problem is suffering. But what if suffering is only part of the story? What if another problem exists alongside it, hidden in plain sight? What if human beings are uniquely capable of receiving what they want and still feeling incomplete? Imagine a universe where every prayer was answered exactly as requested, every loss prevented, every illness removed, every relationship preserved, every ambition fulfilled, every uncertainty eliminated. At first glance, that sounds ideal. Yet if you follow the thought experiment further, something strange emerges. Much of what gives meaning to human experience is inseparable from limitation, uncertainty, struggle, and vulnerability. Courage only exists where fear exists. Loyalty only matters where betrayal is possible. Forgiveness only matters where injury occurs. Hope only matters where outcomes are uncertain. Love itself becomes meaningful partly because it can be lost. This does not solve the problem of suffering. It does not justify pain. It does not explain tragedy. But it introduces a complication that many conversations avoid. Human beings often desire a world free from discomfort, while simultaneously valuing the qualities that discomfort makes possible. That contradiction lives inside nearly everyone. We want growth without challenge, wisdom without mistakes, strength without resistance, meaning without uncertainty. Yet our deepest transformations rarely emerge from comfort. Consider the person who spent years feeling invisible, the person overlooked in school, ignored in relationships, underestimated at work. They carry wounds from those experiences, real wounds. Yet decades later, they often discover that the empathy they developed came directly from those painful experiences. The suffering was not good, the exclusion was not good, but something valuable emerged through it. The difficulty is that nobody would voluntarily choose those experiences beforehand. We recognize meaning afterward. We rarely recognize it during the process. That gap between experience and understanding creates enormous psychological tension. Because while people can often identify lessons in hindsight, they struggle when standing inside confusion without answers. It is one thing to say a painful experience helped you years later. It is another thing entirely to sit in the middle of loss while no explanation exists. This is where many individuals encounter what may be the most uncomfortable aspect of faith, doubt, philosophy, and existence itself: the demand for immediate understanding. Human beings are deeply uncomfortable with delayed meaning. We want explanations now. We want clarity now. We want the story to make sense now. Yet many of the most important realizations in life arrive years after the events that produce them. A breakup that felt catastrophic becomes understandable. A failure that felt devastating becomes transformative. A closed door reveals a path that was invisible before. Not always. Life does not conveniently resolve every mystery, but often enough to create an unsettling possibility. Perhaps human perspective is far narrower than we prefer to admit. If you disagree with that, think about how many opinions you held 10 years ago that now seem incomplete. Think about how many assumptions collapsed once new information appeared. Think about how many certainties turned out to be temporary. The older people become, the more they often recognize a strange pattern. Reality is larger than the stories they initially tell about it. This realization creates a second challenge I want you to think about. If you have ever looked back on a painful experience and discovered meaning you could not see at the time, share that experience below. And if you have experienced suffering that still feels meaningless, share that too. The tension between those two experiences may be one of the most important parts of this entire discussion, because both are real, both exist, Some people find meaning later. Some people continue searching. The conflict between those outcomes sits at the heart of many spiritual and philosophical struggles. There is another reason this conversation becomes emotionally charged. Questions about God are rarely just questions about God. They are often questions about disappointment, questions about grief, questions about unmet expectations, questions about loneliness, questions about fairness, questions about death. When people say they are struggling with belief, they are often struggling with experiences that shattered assumptions they once trusted. A parent loses a child. A faithful person experiences tragedy. Someone spends years praying for healing that never arrives. Another person watches injustice succeed repeatedly. These moments do not simply challenge ideas, they challenge emotional frameworks. They force individuals to confront a reality that does not conform to their expectations. And when expectations collide with reality, people generally respond in one of several ways. Some abandon their assumptions completely. Some double down on them. Some revise them. Some remain suspended in uncertainty for years. Yet, underneath these different responses exists a common human experience: vulnerability. The recognition that we are not fully in control. The recognition that existence refuses to organize itself according to our preferences. This recognition can be terrifying. It can also be transformative. Because once people stop assuming reality owes them certainty, they often begin engaging with life differently. They become less obsessed with controlling every outcome, less attached to guarantees, less dependent on perfect explanations. That does not mean they stop asking questions. It means they stop expecting every question to produce an immediate answer. There is a profound difference between curiosity and demand. Curiosity explores. Demand insists. Curiosity can tolerate uncertainty. Demand cannot. Many people approach existence with demands they do not even realize they are making. Explain everything. Make suffering fair. Make justice visible. Make purpose obvious. Remove ambiguity. Eliminate doubt. Guarantee outcomes. Yet reality consistently resists those demands. Whether one interprets that resistance through a religious lens, a philosophical lens, or a secular lens, the experience remains remarkably similar. Human beings encounter limits, limits of knowledge, limits of understanding, limits of perspective, and those limits can feel deeply uncomfortable because they expose something we spend most of our lives avoiding. We are not the center of reality. We are participants within it. That distinction may sound simple, but psychologically, it changes everything. The moment a person realizes reality is not obligated to satisfy their expectations, a strange freedom begins to emerge. Not because the questions disappear. They do not. Not because suffering becomes easy. It does not. But because the relationship between the individual and uncertainty begins to change. And that change leads directly toward the deeper realization hiding underneath this entire discussion. A realization that has less to do with proving or disproving God, and more to do with understanding why the human search for certainty can become its own source of suffering. The closer we look, the more it appears that the biggest conflict may not exist between belief and disbelief. It may exist between reality as it is and reality as we desperately wish it would be. Imagine sitting across from the version of yourself who existed 20 years from now. Not a wiser version speaking in riddles, not a perfect version who suddenly understands everything, just an older version who has lived through experiences you have not yet encountered. Imagine asking that future self to explain the events that currently make no sense, the betrayal you cannot get over, the loss you still carry, the disappointment that changed how you see the world, the unanswered questions that follow you into quiet moments. What would happen if that future version smiled and said that some of those questions eventually became clearer, some never received complete answers, and some stopped mattering entirely? Most people underestimate how often meaning changes over time. The event remains the same. The interpretation evolves. What once felt devastating becomes understandable. What once felt important becomes irrelevant. What once felt meaningless becomes significant. And sometimes the opposite happens. Something that once seemed significant gradually reveals itself as a distraction. This constant transformation of perspective exposes something profound about the human condition. We are not merely searching for answers, we are searching for stability in a reality that continuously changes, and perhaps that is why discussions about God become so emotionally charged, because beneath theology, philosophy, skepticism, faith and doubt lies a deeper desire, the desire for certainty, the desire to know that existence ultimately makes sense, the desire to believe that our suffering, our love, our sacrifices and our struggles fit into something larger than themselves. The uncomfortable possibility is that many people spend their lives believing the greatest problem is not knowing whether God exists, while rarely considering a more disturbing question. What if certainty itself is the thing they are chasing? What if the real conflict is not between belief and disbelief, but between the human need for absolute answers and the reality that many aspects of existence remain mysterious? Think about how often people divide themselves into opposing camps, believers and skeptics, religious and secular, faith and reason. Yet when you look beneath the surface, the emotional experiences often resemble each other more than anyone wants to admit. Both groups wrestle with mortality, both groups experience grief, both groups confront uncertainty, both groups seek meaning, both groups wonder why suffering exists. Both groups struggle with loneliness, regret, hope, love, fear and loss. The language changes, the emotional landscape often remains surprisingly similar. This observation reveals something many conversations ignore. Human beings are united by questions far more than they are divided by answers. The person convinced they have found certainty and the person convinced certainty is impossible may be responding to the same underlying discomfort. The awareness that life is fragile, the awareness that time is limited, the awareness that nobody escapes suffering completely, the awareness that death eventually confronts everyone. These realities create an emotional pressure that shapes how people interpret existence. Some seek comfort, some seek truth, some seek purpose, most seek all three. Yet those goals do not always align. Sometimes the most comforting answer is not necessarily the most satisfying intellectually. Sometimes the most intellectually satisfying answer provides little emotional comfort. Sometimes purpose emerges from places we never expected. This tension explains why questions about God continue to endure generation after generation. Not because humanity has failed to discuss them enough, not because people are incapable of reasoning, but because the questions themselves touch something fundamental about being human. They force us to confront uncertainty. They force us to confront mortality. They force us to confront the limits of our understanding. And perhaps that confrontation is what many people are actually trying to avoid. There is a scene that repeats itself countless times across human history. Someone experiences profound loss. In the aftermath, they search desperately for explanation. Friends offer theories, philosophers offer frameworks, religious traditions offer interpretations, skeptics offer alternatives, books provide arguments, experts provide perspectives. Yet after all the explanations have been presented, something often remains. The raw emotional reality of the experience itself, because explanations can inform suffering, but they do not automatically remove it. The grieving person still grieves, the lonely person still feels lonely, the confused person still struggles with confusion. This is where an important realization begins to emerge. Human beings frequently assume that understanding will eliminate pain. Yet some forms of pain remain painful even when understood completely. Knowing why something happened does not always make it easier to carry. In some cases, understanding helps. In others, it simply changes the shape of the burden. That realization points toward what may be the biggest problem nobody talks about, not a problem with God, not a problem with religion, not a problem with skepticism, a problem with expectation. Specifically, the expectation that reality should provide the kind of certainty, fairness, clarity, and immediate meaning that human beings naturally desire. When reality fails to meet those expectations, frustration emerges, disappointment emerges, doubt emerges, anger emerges. Yet perhaps the deepest transformation occurs when a person stops demanding certainty and starts engaging honestly with uncertainty. That does not mean abandoning questions, it means asking better ones. Instead of asking why every painful event occurred, a person may begin asking how they will respond to it. Instead of demanding perfect explanations, they may begin exploring what can be learned. Instead of obsessing over guarantees, they may begin paying attention to the present moment. This shift is subtle, but it changes everything, because it moves the individual from a passive relationship with reality to an active one. The mystery remains, the uncertainty remains, the suffering remains, yet the person changes. And once the person changes, their experience of reality changes as well. There is something deeply humbling about recognizing that some questions may never be fully resolved. Modern culture often treats uncertainty as failure. We are encouraged to have opinions immediately. We are encouraged to choose sides immediately. We are encouraged to present ourselves as certain even when we are not. Yet some of the most thoughtful people throughout history have displayed a different quality. Intellectual humility, the willingness to acknowledge the limits of their knowledge, the willingness to remain curious, the willingness to sit with questions that resist simple answers. That humility can feel uncomfortable because it removes the illusion of control. But it also creates space for growth, space for reflection, space for wisdom, space for perspectives that certainty often prevents us from seeing. Maybe that is why the biggest questions continue to matter, not because they can always be solved, but because they reveal who we become while wrestling with them. The person who has never questioned anything may possess confidence, but they may lack depth. The person who has questioned everything may possess depth, but they may struggle with peace. Most people spend their lives trying to find a balance between those extremes. They want enough certainty to function and enough openness to keep learning. They want enough meaning to endure suffering and enough honesty to avoid self-deception. They want answers, but they also want truth. And truth is often more complicated than answers. So when people talk about the biggest problem with God, perhaps the conversation is pointing towards something larger than theology. Perhaps it is pointing toward the uncomfortable reality that human beings are meaning-seeking creatures, living in a universe that does not always reveal its meaning clearly. Perhaps it is pointing toward our fear of uncertainty, our fear of randomness, our fear of mortality, our fear that the questions matter more than the answers, or perhaps it is pointing toward something even more personal. The possibility that the struggle itself is part of what makes us human, not the certainty, not the conclusion, not the victory of one worldview over another. The struggle, the search, the willingness to confront difficult questions honestly, the courage to keep moving forward without possessing every answer, because in the end the most unsettling possibility may not be that reality contains mystery. The most unsettling possibility may be that we spend so much time trying to escape mystery that we never learn what it was trying to teach us. And whether someone approaches that idea through faith, skepticism, philosophy, or simple curiosity, the challenge remains the same. To face uncertainty without surrendering to despair, to seek meaning without demanding guarantees, to remain open without becoming lost. To continue asking questions even when the answers arrive slowly. And perhaps most importantly, to recognize that the search itself may reveal more about the human condition than any final answer ever could.